Hi everyone, welcome to the next session that we have on critical reasoning. For those of you who've missed the first session, no problem. We have the link for the session, the last session that we had on the description box. You can go ahead and check that out. But for today, we are looking at the evil twin of weaken the argument questions. We saw weaken the argument questions in the last session we had. We spoke about what we need to keep in mind where weaken the argument questions are concerned, what the traps can be, what the patterns are. So I'm really glad that you're here with me today to look at the evil twin of weaken the argument questions. We're all aware of weaken the argument questions, and the next thing that comes to mind when we talk of weaken the argument questions is strengthen the argument questions. But I'm not going to talk about this just yet. We're going to look at this probably next week, but we are going to look at another question type, which is identify the flaw. Now, I will admit that this is not the kind of question that a lot of people pay too much attention to. It's one of those, what people categorize as miscellaneous questions. You just might happen to see a flaw in the argument question come up. But what we've seen in the latest edition of the OG, which is the official guide for those of you who are not aware, in the latest edition of the OG, we've seen that there are more than usual identify the flaw questions than we normally see. So I thought this was a good moment for us to visit this particular question type and understand what it is about the flaw in the argument question that we need to be clear about. Okay, so let's first talk about why am I calling it weaken the argument's evil twin. We need to understand how an identify the flaw question is different from a weaken the argument question. But before we do all of that, let me start off by introducing myself. I'm sorry, my video is not on. There's some problem I seem to have with my video. This is me. My name is Nitha, and I am the head here at Crack Verbal, Verbal section at least. And we will be looking at some new aspect of the verbal section of the GMAT every week. I've been doing this for quite some years, and what I've realized over the years is the best way to tackle verbal questions on the GMAT is by looking at the logic of it. And that's exactly what we plan to do in every session that we have together. That's what we did in the earlier session. That's what we'll do in this session as well. So what I'm hoping to do is that we will talk about the flaw in the argument question, but forget about the strategy, forget about the rules and all of that stuff. Let's just look at the logic. What I want to do today is look at the same scenario, the same example that I'd looked at when we looked at weaken the argument questions last week. Once again, if you missed that session, if you just look at the description box, you'll see the link to the weaken the argument session that we had a few weeks ago. But no worries, I will introduce the whole example once again. I'd like us to just imagine a scenario. All right, let's just imagine a scenario that let's say it's about 11 p.m. and you're chilling, you're relaxing, you're watching a movie maybe, and the phone rings. And then you get to know that your close friend Sam has been arrested. You can hear him on the other side and say, "Hey, the police have arrested me, and please come and get me." Okay. So what's happening? You want to know what's happening. So Sam tells you that somebody called Tom has been murdered, and police find out that Sam's gun was used to kill Tom. And because Sam's gun was used to kill Tom, the police have gone and arrested Sam, and they're saying that Sam has murdered Tom. This is the scenario. This is what Sam has told you. Now, the question that I have to you is, what do you think is the problem? Very logically speaking, forget critical reasoning, forget GMAT. Logically speaking, what is the problem with the reasoning that the police have used? Let's once again explore the reasoning that the police have used. The police has said that they found someone called Tom murdered, and they've also realized that the murder weapon was Sam's gun. And because the murder weapon was Sam's gun, they've gone and concluded that Sam is the one who has killed Tom. There is some problem. There is some, let me put it as, some logical flaw in the reasoning that the police have given. If you think about it, this is the kind of stuff that we see every day. So what do you think, logically speaking, is the problem with the reasoning that the police has presented? Let's see. The one thing that immediately comes to mind, if you think about why it is that the police have gone and arrested Sam, is the fact that they think just because the murder weapon belonged to Sam, they think it is Sam who went and killed Tom. But is this logical? Does this make any sense? Just because the murder weapon belonged to Sam, it doesn't mean that Sam killed Tom. Maybe somebody else took the weapon. Maybe the weapon was stolen. Maybe anything, just about anything could be the reason for Tom finally being murdered. It doesn't mean that Sam has gone and killed him. Okay, now the flaw in the argument is that the police have assumed that just because Sam's gun has been used, that means Sam has killed Tom. This is the flaw in their argument. Let's very briefly talk about how is a weaken the argument different from a flaw in the argument. All right. Now, what we've seen so far is in a weaken the argument question, you're given an argument and the argument will have a conclusion, right? We know that much. In a weaken the argument question, they have 5 options they give you. And one of these options can be used to show that this conclusion is not necessarily true, right? We already know that that's what you have to do in a weaken the argument question. But in a flaw in the argument question, the argument that is given to you is already weak. Okay? This argument already has a weakener. There is a problem that is weakening the conclusion. We have to look at the options presented and see which one of these options has made this argument already weak. That's the difference. That's why I say that flaw in the argument question is actually the evil twin of weaken the argument question. In a weaken the argument question, one of the options will weaken the conclusion. In a flaw in the argument question, the argument is already weak. You have to find out which one of the options has weakened the argument already, which one of the options has presented a flaw, and why is it that the conclusion that has been drawn is already weak. Okay, most of the flaw in the argument questions will have the word flaw in it, but not always so. We have to look at how the question stem has been presented for us to understand. So let's understand this. Let's just, simplify it a little further. A flaw in the argument question is asking you to identify an already existing weakness. It might be a gap. It might be some misunderstanding, some mistake in the reasoning that has been presented in the argument. What you need to constantly ask yourself is this a flaw in the reasoning? Okay. Now, the options presented might present you information that's commonsensical, might present you information that might be true by itself. But the question you're constantly asking yourself is this a flaw in the reasoning? One cue I can give you right away. If the option is not even talking about the reasoning presented, is not even talking about the scope that has been presented clearly, that's not going to be the flaw in the argument. So your job when you get a flaw in the argument question is to identify what is the information given. You want to figure out what is the claim that has been made. And then you want to work out the logic. What is the flaw in the reasoning that has been presented? And that is what you're looking for in the options. Now, in these kind of questions, you have to focus on the error in the logic that has been presented. And that error will make the conclusion seem not so sensible, not so reliable, right? So what is it that we need to do? Let's understand what we need to do. We need to first simplify the claim, figure out what is it that has been claimed, what has been concluded, what is it that the author is presenting to us as a conclusion. We then need to understand the reasoning, because keep in mind, you are looking for the flaw in the reasoning, right? So you have to first understand what is the reason. Only then will you be able to figure out what the flaw is. So you've simplified the claim, you've understood the reasoning, and then you're going to check, is there a pattern? There are a few typical patterns that you see time and time again. I'm not saying these are the only patterns, but these are the patterns that you see time and time again. You do know, I've mentioned this several times, that the GMAT is all about patterns. Once you recognize the typical trends and the typical traps and the typical patterns, it becomes easier for you to tackle a GMAT question. So check. Is there a pattern? Let's very quickly have a look at the typical patterns that you normally see or typical flaws that you normally see in a flaw in the argument question. The most commonly seen flaw is causation versus correlation, where sometimes all that you have is a correlation where two things just happen to be happening together. And for some reason, the author seems to think that this one thing is causing the other. For example, let's say X and Y happen together. So it just happens to be that they happen together, but the author might conclude that X has caused Y or Y has caused X or something along those lines. Let's look at an example to better know. Okay. If I say, every time I eat a breakfast, I have a productive day at work. Therefore, eating a big breakfast must be what makes me more productive. It just so happens that I ate a big breakfast and had a productive day at work. These two things happen together, but that doesn't mean that this is responsible for this. So the flaw is that I'm assuming that the big breakfast is responsible for my productive day when it just happens that these two things happen together. Very, very common flaw. Another very commonly seen flaw is generalization. So it something happens to be true for one case and you assume it's true for all the cases. Okay? We've seen this very often. You see it in strengthen the argument, you see it in weaken the argument, you also see it in flaw in the argument. For example, if I say I tried one sushi restaurant and it was terrible. Okay, all sushi must taste bad. So what's the flaw here? I have taken one experience that it was, a bad experience for me, and I've gone and assumed that it is true for all the cases. This generalization is one, yet another very commonly seen flaw in a flaw in the argument kind of question. Okay, we've seen two already. Let's look at the third, false dilemma, where you're saying, hey, it's either this or it's this, my way or the highway kind of. But this is not always necessarily the case. But the author seems to have assumed that these are the only two possible scenarios. Okay, for example, if I say, if you don't want to join the gym, you must not care about your health. What is the flaw? The flaw is that the author is assuming that if you care about your health, the only way to show that you care about your health is by joining the gym. He is not taking into consideration that maybe you can go for a walk, maybe this guy is into yoga, maybe this guy is into Pilates or whatever. I don't necessarily have to go to the gym to show that I care about the health. But the author, what is the flaw in the reasoning? The author has assumed that this or this is the only scenario, right? These are the commonly seen flaws. See, there are various flaws. If you're going to break it down, you would probably think of a zillion flaws. But all in all, broadly speaking, these are the three common flaws that you see in flaw in the argument questions. I wanted to quickly put these flaws in front of you. I didn't want this to be a class, but for those of you who are not very familiar with flaw in the argument questions, these question types can come across as being very tricky. It can be very daunting because what happens in these question types is that the options presented can be very, very complex. The way in which these options are presented can be extremely wordy and the sentence structure can be very complex. But if you're very clear about what is the claim, what is the reasoning presented, and logically speaking, what could be the flaw in that reasoning, it becomes slightly easier. So now that we know the three common flaws, we're a little more prepared to tackle the questions that we're going to see in a bit. Okay. So let's now, before we look at any question, just quickly have a glance at the 3 points that will help you get the correct answer. We spoke about this when we spoke about weaken the argument questions as well, but the same 3 points apply no matter which question type you're looking at in the GMAT critical reasoning. Okay, let's look at these 3 points. Number one, I've said this already, simplify the information given to you. If you'd like, you can use a scratch pad. Now in the GMAT, please keep in mind, they will give you a scratch pad to do your scratch work on. So that is available. So, it's a good idea for you to use the scratch pad and simplify the information as much as you can. This helps you avoid rereading. So step number one is to try and break down what is the data given to you, what is the claim being made, what is the reasoning being presented, simplify that information, and be sure that you're focusing on what you expect to do. In a flaw in the argument question, you are asking yourself, what is the flaw? So every option that you look at, you're asking yourself, is this the flaw? Or is this just some general piece of information I know to be true? This is the most important because what the GMAT test setters know is that as you are going through the 5 options, as you progress from the first to the second to the third, you kind of lose track of what you're looking for. So what the GMAT is testing to a large extent is how sharp is your focus. Are you focused on the fact that you are looking for the flow? Always, 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 elimination is your friend. The GMAT is an exam of elimination. Focus on what doesn't work. Because many a time you might know that, hey, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. I don't know about this, but if I've eliminated the remaining four, the fifth has to be my answer. These are points for you to remember no matter what the question type is. Okay, that was just a refresher on what flaw in the argument questions are. For those of you who've just joined, I want to quickly tell you once again the difference between weak in the argument questions and flaw in the argument questions. Now, you have to keep in mind that sometimes the flaw in the argument question, in the question stem, you can have the word flaw being presented, but you have to stop and check what is the question stem actually saying. Just because the word flaw is there or just because the word weaken is there, don't blindly go for it. Understand what the argument is saying. Understand what the question stem is asking of you. Let's briefly look at what is the difference. In a weaken the argument question, an argument is presented to you. The argument, of course, will have a conclusion that is going to be given to you in a weaken the argument question. What you are expected to do is you have to look at the 5 options that have been given to you and see which one of these 5 options is going to tell you or show you that the conclusion that has been presented is not necessarily true. So you are finding a new piece of information that is going to weaken the argument. All right. In a flaw in the argument question, an argument is given to you. There is a conclusion that has been presented. The difference is this argument is already weak. Okay. The reasoning that has been presented, there is some flaw, there is some problem. In a weaken the argument question, your argument has already been weakened for you. You have to look at the 5 options and see which one of these 5 options will tell you what has made it weak. So the option that you're looking for will tell you something has been, something has been overlooked. There's been some misunderstanding. Maybe there's some generalization that's been made, or maybe there is some false dilemma, or maybe there's actually a correlation, but a causality has been determined. Something of those sorts will be presented. Okay, that was for those of you who joined it. Now that we have this understanding in place, let's look at a few questions where you can actually put all of this understanding into use. All right. I hope all of you are ready. Those of you who are not, those of you would probably like to go and grab a paper and a pen, because if you're somebody who prefers to do some scribbling as you're trying out questions, I'll give you a couple of seconds. Please go ahead and do that. What we will do is look at one question at a time. And I will give you 2 full minutes. I hope all of you can see this little stopwatch that I have on the screen right now. I will give you a little, just about 2 minutes and then some. Okay. When I say then some, it's just to, just to goad you on to finally decide on an answer. And once this 2 minutes is up, we'll discuss every option. We'll understand what the argument is, what we were expected to do, and so on. I hope all of you are ready. Let's look at the very first question together. Here we are. Your time starts now. Let me get this out of the way. All right, let's have a look. I'm not going to give away the answer right now. I'd like us to go through the entire argument like you would had you been seeing this for the first time. I'd like to break it down together so that we can talk about how it is that you need to and analyze an argument of this. Okay. Now, I'm sure all of you have read the argument. You've seen the question stem. The question stem says the reasoning used by the gallery owner. It's the gallery owner who's presented this argument. The reasoning used by the gallery owner is flawed because it. So yes, you have the word flawed, and they're saying that there is some reasoning that has been presented because there's a claim that's been presented, and the reasoning presented to come to this claim is flawed in some way because of one of these. Okay, let's just look at what the information is presented. The gallery owner is arguing that the painting is likely a previously uncatalogued Van Gogh by pointing to a few key factors. Okay, first, he says that the subject matter is one that Van Gogh been painted. That's what has been given to us over here. He also mentions that experts agree that the brush strokes and the color combinations in the paintings are typical of Van Gogh's later work. So, here he's talking of that as well. And lastly, the owner says that the internal evidence that he's talking about here, the internal evidence, it's strongly supporting the conclusion that the painting is an authentic Van Gogh. This is the information that has been presented. So in this question, you're expected to analyze all of this is the reasoning, the detailing that he's given. Based on this detailing, he has claimed that it makes it virtually certain that this is a previously uncatalogued late Van Gogh and as such a bargain at its price. So this is the information that has been given to us, and we know there is a claim. The claim has been mentioned over here. We also know that there is some flaw in the reasoning. We have to figure out what the flaw is. You're expected to analyze the reasoning provided and identify the flaw. In other words, is there any gap? Is there any weakness already present in the reason? Is there an unsupported assumption? Is there some kind of a pattern? Is there an alternative explanation that has not been ruled out? What is happening over here? That's what we have to figure out. Okay. So ultimately, you have to choose the answer that best explains why the argument is. Okay, let's look. The very first option, I mean, most people read this option and they wonder, what does this even mean? This is a signature kind of thing that you will see. I mentioned this a while ago, that you see in Flaw in the argument questions. The options will be worded in such a complex manner that the first task is to figure out what the option even means. Let's look at this. It is flawed because it ignores the fact that there can be general agreement that something is the case without its being the case. What does this even mean? Let's simplify. Simply put, this option is saying that the flaw is that the gallery owner has ignored the possibility that even though people, or in this case, experts might agree on something, it doesn't mean that something is true. I'll say it again. This option is saying that the flaw is that the gallery owner has ignored the possibility that even though experts might agree on something, it doesn't mean it's true. But does the gallery owner ignore this fact? No, the gallery owner does not ignore this fact. In fact, the gallery owner mentions expert agreement about the brush strokes and style of the painting, but he doesn't say that the conclusion is solely based on their agreement. He's also using other evidence like subject matter and internal features of the painting and all that stuff to support the claim. When you ignore something, it means you're completely overlooking something, but the gallery owner is clearly considering the agreement. He's not ignoring it. Okay, but forget all that. More important than all of that, is this a flaw in the reasoning? No, it's not. This is definitely not the flaw. I understand how, you may not know what this means and you may hold on to it. Fine. Let's hold on. Okay. Let's imagine you don't understand what this means and you're holding on. Remember, the GMAT is an exam of elimination. I don't know what A means. Let's suppose I'm going to hold on, move on to the next. Let's see. I'm not going to eliminate unless I have a distinct reason. I'm going to look at B. Option B says, the gallery owner makes a mistake. When you say it's neglects to, he makes a mistake by not citing expert authority to back up the claim about the painting subject matter. See, basically, this means that the flaw is the failure to involve experts. The experts have not confirmed whether the painting subject matter is helping us show that the painting is authentic. That's what the option actually means. But the gallery owner does not neglect expert authority. Can you see that? In fact, the gallery owner is explicitly saying that expert agreement is there about brush strokes and colors being consistent with Van Gogh's later style. So we can eliminate B because the gallery owner does refer to expert agreement. All right, so this is surely not the answer. I had a problem with eliminating A, but I have no problem with eliminating B. Let's look at what option C means. Option Option C is saying that it assumes without sufficient warrant that the only reason, okay, now there is no such reason, but let's just look at the whole the option, that the only reason anyone would want to acquire a painting is to make profit. He does say that it's a bargain at its price, but there is no assumption in the argument about why someone would buy the painting. Right? The gallery owner discusses the painting's authenticity and its a value as a bargain, but does not make any claims about profit motives. The fact that he assumes anything about the profit is not the flaw in the reason. This is also out. Option D is saying that it provides no evidence that the painting is more likely to be an uncatalogued Van Gogh than to be a painting by someone else who painted that particular subject in Van Gogh style. Again, a really complex worded option. But if you simplify it, you'll understand that this option is saying that the flaw is that the gallery owner doesn't prove that the painting is more likely to be an actual Van Gogh than an imitation or a painting by someone else in Van Gogh style. So basically, the argument does not rule out alternative explanations. Let's look at this logic. Right. The owner provides evidence about the painting's subject matter, brush strokes, color combinations. But if you think about it, these things that I just spoke of, brush strokes, color combinations, etc., these characteristics can easily be copied by another artist, right? The argument has not considered the possibility that the painting might actually be an imitation that somebody has intentionally copied Van Gogh's style. But without doing any of that, the gallery owner has gone and declared that the painting is an uncatalogued work of Van Gogh. The gallery owner has also not bothered providing additional evidence to show the painting is definitely a Van Gogh. So what's being mentioned in option D does seem to be, to some extent, makes sense. The flaw is that the author has not gone and the flaw is that the gallery owner has not gone and confirmed, hey, is this a copy of some sort? Looks good, I'm going to hold on to this. Option E is saying that the flaw is that the gallery owner is biased and trying to prove the painting as a Van Gogh for their own benefit. He attempts to establish a particular conclusion for his own self-interest. So the simplified version is that he wants to he has his own benefit in mind and it's not about the concern for the truth. There is no evidence in the argument that the gallery owner is intentionally biased. We don't know that about, it's all about his self-interest. There is no such evidence there. The flaw is supposed to be in the reasoning itself. It's not about the owner's motives. So even if the owner does stand to make a profit, this is not the flaw in the reasoning that has been presented. All the reasoning that has been presented is that, hey, look, subject matter is similar, broad brushstrokes, distinctive combinations. All of this shows it is a Van Gogh. But what is the flaw? He has not gone and checked, hey, could it be a copy? He has not gone and checked that. That is the problem. So his claim is not very believable because he has not gone and checked, is it a copy or not? He's just gone and based on this kind of evidence. And that is what option D is saying. Suddenly, when I compare option A and D, A suddenly, it doesn't really seem to make sense as such. Even if I don't understand the meaning, this logically makes sense. My answer is option D. What you've seen in this particular example is that it's tricky to figure out number one, to figure out what these options even mean. Number two, it's difficult to keep track of the fact that you're looking for what is the flaw in the argument. When you read the option by itself, it may seem to make sense, but you have to constantly ask yourself, is this the flaw in the argument? Right? Okay, tricky one. Let's try one. Here we are. Once again, I have this 2-minute counter. I don't have it on screen because it's kind of covering the question a bit. So I will let you know when the 2 minutes are up. Time starts now. Okay, for those of you who've just joined, we are solving this question. So it's okay if you've just joined, please go ahead and try and give it a go. All right, time's up. Let's have a look. The question once again says the argument is most vulnerable to which of the following criticism? So now the word vulnerable, you see this particular word in weaken the argument questions also. This is what I meant at the beginning of the session. When I mentioned that there are these typical words, for example, flaw, of course, flaw and weaken, you see these. If it's a flaw in the argument question, you will see flaw. If it's a weaken the argument question, you will see weaken. But the fact of the matter is you can see flaw in weaken the argument questions in your question stem also. You can see weaken in a flaw in the argument question also. And words like vulnerable, all of these you can see in weaken the argument questions, also in flaw of the argument questions also, which makes it a very fine line. Fortunately, even if you misunderstand a flaw in the argument question to be a weaken the argument question, it's not going to horribly, things are not going to go horribly wrong. But it's a good idea to read the question stem and try and identify what is expected of you. Your task is to figure out the flaw in the reasoning. You have to ask yourself, did the author overlook something important? Is there an assumption that they're making without any evidence? Or is there an alternative possibility that hasn't been considered? What is the flaw in the reasoning? Okay, let's just look at the argument. Let's look at the facts that have been presented. We know step number one is simplifying the argument as much as is possible. Let's check. The author argues that bacteria might have developed on Mars and traveled to Earth on meteorites. Okay, that bacteria developed on Mars. Okay, early in history and it's traveled to Earth on meteorites. However, they claim that bacteria from different planets would have noticeable differences in protein structure. It's okay if you don't know about the science of it, just take it at face value that there's some notable differences in protein structure. Since no bacteria on Earth shows such differences, the author concludes that any Martian bacteria that arrived on Earth must have died out. Here we are. So even if bacteria did arrive on Earth from Mars, they must have died out. Please keep in mind that a flaw in the argument question will always have a claim. Okay. Your job is to look at the reasoning that has been used to come to this claim and figure out what is the flaw in this reasoning. So we have to figure out what is the flaw in the reasoning used to conclude that any Martian bacteria that arrived on Earth must have died. Let's check. This is the claim that they've come up with. Keep the see now, unlike weaken the argument question. Now let me point out another difference. In weaken the argument question, your singular focus is the conclusion, right? But in flaw in the argument question, yes, the conclusion, the claim is important, but what is more important is the reasoning that has been presented because you're figuring out the flaw in that reason. So only focusing on the claim is not going to be enough. We have to focus on the reasoning. Here is the reasoning. Okay. So we need to take the reasoning into consideration, not just focus on the claim. Let's check. The argument is most vulnerable to which of the following criticisms. Let's look at each option. Now, option A says, I'm going to simplify each option instead of reading it out, okay? Option A says that the argument is flawed because it does not prove that bacteria existed on Mars or was developed, or that it fails to establish whether bacteria actually developed on Mars. It doesn't prove that the bacteria was developed or it, at any point of time existed on Mars. But the argument is, if you think about it, the argument is already assuming that this is possible. If you read the argument, you will realize that it has been, bacteria developed on Mars and was carried out to Earth. So the argument is already assuming that this is possible. And the argument is focusing on what happened after the bacteria reached Earth, whether it died out or whatever. Okay. So the flaw is not about proving whether bacteria developed in Mars or not. So this is irrelevant. This is out. Let's look at B. Now, option B is suggesting that the argument is flawed because it doesn't discuss how likely it was for bacteria to travel from Mars to Earth. As is the case in option A, the argument already assumes that bacteria has been transported from Mars to Earth by a meteorite, and the focus is on what happened after that. The likelihood of transportation is not the issue. Okay. So if that is not it is not talking about the reasoning at all. This is also out. Option C. Now, option C is saying that the flaw is that the argument is not considering other ways in which bacteria might have traveled from Mars. Now, see, this might be a fact. That they're only talking about the fact that it was transported to Earth by a meteorite. Yes, it is a fact that they're not considering the other ways in which bacteria might have traveled from Mars. But is this a flaw? The method of transportation is not the focus of the argument. The argument is saying that, hey, no two bacterial strains on the earth are different enough to have arisen on different planets. Therefore, the bacteria that arrived from Mars have died out. How they came, whether different modes of transportation were used other than meteorite, all of this is not at all part of the reasoning. If it's not even part of the reasoning, how can it be a flaw in the reasoning? So, no, this is also irrelevant. Let's look at D. Option D is saying that there is an important oversight that has happened. It fails to consider something. Over here also it's saying it fails to establish, fails to establish. This is also saying it fails to consider. As a matter of fact, all of them are saying it fails to do something. Let's see what option D is. It fails to consider whether all bacteria now on Earth could have arisen from transported Martian bacteria. Well, let's check. Let's simplify this. The argument is claiming that no earth bacteria are different enough. Here it is, okay? No two bacterial strains on earth are different enough to have arisen on different planets. So they're saying that no bacteria or no two bacteria on earth are different enough to actually be from other planets. But one thing that the argument is not taking into consideration is that maybe all the bacteria on earth, maybe all the bacteria that is presently there on Earth could have originally actually come from Mars through meteorites or whatever. If all the bacteria that is presently on Earth have actually come from Martian bacteria, then there would be no distinct Martian bacteria left, right? They're all from Mars. So what's happening here is the author is saying that there are no two bacterial strains on Earth that are different enough to have arisen on other planets. And that's why, oh, if they did arrive on Earth from Mars, they have died out. What they're not taking into consideration is that probably all the bacteria that we now presently have on Earth actually are Martian bacteria. That's why you can't find any difference in the bacteria. This is something that the author has not taken into consideration. This is the weakness. This is the weakness in the reasoning. This is the flaw in the reasoning. Looks really good. Let's just hold on to this. All right. I mean, so far, this looks good. So this is how it's going to be in the GMAT, right? The best thing you can do is, okay, I have a distinct reason. This is not it. This is not it. This is not it. Please don't go and fall in love with an option that you think is probably nice. You have to make sure you look at all the options and only then make a decision. All right. D looks good. I'm going to hold on to it, but I still have E to consider. E is also saying that the argument fails to do something. Let's see what E is. Option E is saying that the bacteria that started on Earth, but it fails to consider whether there could have been strains of bacteria that originated on Earth and later died out. So it's talking about the bacteria that was born on Earth and died. But now, see, if you think about it, the argument is not about the bacteria that was on Earth. The argument is about bacteria that came from Mars. So bacteria that originated on Earth is not at all relevant to us. E is also out. My answer is option D. The only thing we can do in a GMAT critical reasoning argument is understand that this is the world that we have. And if it's a flaw in the argument question, this is the claim that has been made. This is the reasoning. What is the flaw? Look at each one. Hold on to the one that looks really tempting. Eliminate the others. Whatever you're left with, even if you're not very sure, that is wrong. That's what's happening over here. We're going to do a similar thing with the next question as well. Anybody, any questions, please feel free to put it on the chat. And, we can always discuss in greater detail. Meanwhile, what I am going to do is give you one more question. And let's try and see if we are able to logically analyze what the flaw in the argument is. As always, 2 minutes. Time starts now. Here we are. All right, time's up. Let's have a look. Okay. Now, I'm sure those of you who have looked at this argument must have, I mean, especially if you've looked at the two arguments with me already, we've seen how there's usually these typical patterns that you see. I am sure you must have seen some typical pattern, and this is a very commonly seen pattern, especially in flaw in the argument and even weak in the argument questions, right? So the question stem is telling us a flaw in the argument above is that. So this tells us that there is some argument that has been given, so some reasoning that has been presented, and on the basis of this reasoning, a claim has been made. Okay, let's check. Let's see what the argument is saying at all. Very short argument, so please, but don't be fooled by the length of the argument. The argument states that people who live unusually long lives tend to have been lean young adults who gained approximately 1 pound every year. This is what the reasoning that is being presented. And based on this reasoning, the argument has concluded that lean young adults can improve if you're already a lean young adult, you can improve your chance of living a long life by gaining 1 pound every year. So look at what's happening. What has been noticed is that if you were a lean adult a long time ago and you gained 1 pound every year, those people went on to live a long life. So if you are a young, lean adult right now and you want to live a long life, go ahead and gain 1 pound every year. Just as I say this, or just as you simplify this, I'm sure that it must have struck you, oh, wait, I get what's happening. You can see a pattern emerging already. But your job is to analyze the reasoning and identify its flaw. You kind of probably, I'm almost sure that most of you must have, I get it. I can see the pattern. You're probably not able to put your finger on it, but that's how analysis helps. The more you analyze, the faster these patterns come to you. Let's look at each option. Okay. The very first option means that the argument is assuming, see, this is a very complex one. Let's just look at the option together. The flaw in the argument above is that it gives reason for the truth of its conclusion that presupposes the truth of that conclusion. What does this even mean? This is a signature flaw in the argument. And, there's another question type we will look at in one of the later sessions that we have called method of reasoning. This is another question type where you see these extremely verbose and complicated answer options which you don't even know what it means. Let me try and break it down. Okay. And please, let me rest assured that the more you analyze, the more you learn to break down these questions, it will get easier. But I can tell you this right away, there's no magic pill. It takes practice to unravel these kind of questions. Let me simplify this for you. So this option means that the argument is assuming, when it's saying it's presupposing, that means it's assuming something in advance, that the conclusion is already true without providing new evidence. Okay. It gives reasons for the truth of its conclusion that it's presupposing the truth of that conclusion. So whatever reason is being presented is already assuming that the conclusion is true. There's no new evidence being presented. By the way, this is an option. Excuse me. This is an option you see a lot. This is called circular reasoning, by the way. Please feel free to read up on circular reasoning. This is something you see very often in logical reasoning. But this is, in simplified words, it is saying that the argument is assuming that the conclusion is already true without giving any new evidence. However, this is not what is happening. The argument is presenting evidence that lean young adults gaining weight and is using this to support the conclusion. So the issue is not, about any presupposition or anything of that sort, but it's a misunderstanding of the relationship between weight gain and longevity. This is what makes option A wrong. Option B, again, a simplified version of what option B says, is that the argument is acting as, proceeds as though is acting as if a condition, that is weight gain, that by itself is enough to guarantee a certain result. So it's saying that the argument acts as though a particular condition, that is weight gain, is the only way to achieve a certain result. What is a certain result? Longevity. However, the argument doesn't make this claim. It is only suggesting that weight gain is one of the possible ways to live longer. Hey, look, you're a lean adult. You want to live longer? Go ahead, gain a pound every year. Nowhere does it say that it's the only way, must always be present. Nowhere is it suggesting that this is the sole condition. So, no, this is not what is happening in the reasoning. Therefore, it can't be a flaw in the B is out. Option C assumes without proof that two phenomena that occur together share an underlying cause. They're saying there are two phenomena and both have the same cause. Is that what's happening? What are the two phenomena being mentioned over here? Weight gain and longevity. Do weight gain and longevity share the same cause? It's saying may share the same. Where is it? Assumes that proof the two phenomena that occur together share an underlying cause. What causes they've not mentioned? Maybe it's genetics or whatever. But is that what's happening? No, that's not what the argument is saying. Instead, what it is saying is that one thing causes the other thing. You go and gain weight. If you're a lean young adult, you gain weight 1 pound a year, you will go and live longer. So they're not saying two things have the same cause. They're saying one thing has caused the other. But that's not what's happening. Okay. So now a lot of people feel that option C is correct. It looks really tempting, but it is not assuming that two phenomena occur together and have the same cause. It is assuming that one thing has caused the other. So C is out. Option D is this. Actually, if you now that we've discussed this and we've broken things down a little better to understand if this is the option, it becomes quite evident that D is a contender. It says a flaw in the argument above is that the argument concludes that one phenomena is the cause of another, when at most what might have been established is an association between them. This is a very nice way of describing correlation versus causation. I'm just going to quickly, for those of you who missed when we were talking about the kind of flaws, one very common flaw that you see is causation, where what is probably happening is that there are two things happening together and the author seems to think that one thing causes the other. This is a very, very common type of flaw that you see in flaw in the argument. You see it in reading comprehension also, by the way, and you also see it in weak in the argument questions. So that is what option D is actually saying. It is actually describing the flaw. The argument observes that people who live a long life, these people were lean young adults who gained weight on a yearly basis, and assumes that this means that weight gain causes a long life. Okay. There's also some degree of generalization happening here, which is yet another common pattern, where this is something you might have seen with one person or few people. That doesn't mean it applies to everybody. So there's also a generalization flaw that's happening over here. Just because two things happen together, it doesn't mean that one thing causes the other. So the argument fails to consider that weight gain and longevity might both be happening because some other factor, or it may be irrelevant. It is not necessary that you can say one thing is causing the other. Really looks good, especially after I saw C, I'm going to hold on to it. Option E is describing that the flaw is where the argument improperly generalizes from a small subgroup to the entire population. Now, this looks really tempting at first, but this is actually not what's happening over here. Okay, the argument is focusing specifically on lean young adults and their weight gain. It's not saying, hey, look, lean young adults gained 1 pound a year. So all of you, the rest of the population, lean young adults gained 1 pound a year and they lived a long life. Therefore, all of you, whether you're lean or whether you're fat or whether you're tall, go ahead and gain 1 pound a year and you will live a long life. That's not what's happening. But at first glance, this looks really tempting. What's happening is tendency widely shared by a subgroup within a given population will not necessarily be widely shared by that population as a whole. Nothing of that sort is happening. He is only talking about one subgroup. He is not talking about the population as a whole. This is not even happening. You cannot categorize this as a food. Your answer here is option D. What I've attempted to do in this session is point out one question type, which we are seeing more and more nowadays in many of the students who have taken the GMAT have told us about. And what we've also noticed is that these question types seem to have figured more prominently in the latest version. Many students seem to mistake when they see the word vulnerable, or they see the word flaw, or they see the word weaken. It's a little difficult for them to decipher, are we talking about a weaken the argument question or a flaw in the argument question? It's important that we understand the difference between these two question types. And it's important for us to determine that by looking at the question stem, figuring out what is expected of us. These are the kind of questions, this is the kind of reasoning that we do in all the sessions that we have together, be it on YouTube or be it on the live classes that we have during the weekends. So every weekend we have a verbal class or a quant class or a DI class happening, where we look at official questions in this way and we break down each question, we break down the options to understand the logic. It's not just about solving a question. Getting the answer to the question is the easiest of the lot when you're prepping. What's more important is breaking down the argument, breaking down the patterns, figuring out where you've gone wrong, figuring out why one option looks really tempting, but it's actually not correct. This is the exact kind of analysis that we do every weekend during our classes. So for those of you who've attended our classes, you know that already. Those of you who haven't, please reach out, and we'd love to have you join us, for our classes where we can have this kind of discussion together, where everybody talks and it's a very lively conversation that we have going. For those of you who'd like to have this kind of interaction every week, please go right ahead and come on to our channel and check out the sessions that we have every week. We've discussed flaw in the argument today. As a matter of fact, the earlier session that we had was weaken the argument. And the reason I've had flaw today is so that you can make a comparison between weaken and flaw. So if you've missed that session, if you go onto the description box, there's a link given for the weaken the argument session. Also, you can have a look at that. Next week, we're hoping to look at yet another interesting yet another interesting question type, where we'll once again discuss patterns. We'll once again try to analyze how we can figure out patterns and understand which option works and which one doesn't. Thank you everyone for your time. Hope to see you all in the session that follows. Bye everyone.